Public cloud spending seems to be leveling off, according to a recent Rubin Worldwide report. Is that the case? If so, what does that mean? Let's talk about it. Welcome to the Cloud Computing Insider. This channel explores the ins and outs of cloud computing without an agenda or following into the narrative set by big tech marketing. We look at what works and what does not, and the actual value of this technology in a balanced and information-forward way. If that interests you, please subscribe, like, and comment. I'm your host, David Linthicum, author, speaker, cloud and AI architect, top 10 cloud and AI influencer, B-list geek, and over-the-hill mountain biker. Let's get started. So kind of the genesis of this topic is I was attending a event this week sponsored by a mainframe software vendor. And I do that a lot. I always like to, attend the cloud events and the mainframe events and, private cloud events and get the gist of where the technology is spinning. They had a report that was very interesting to me. And this was a report that was done by Rubin Worldwide. And I'll go ahead and put the link to the report in the description. And I'll talk about the graph that I want to talk about today in the report. I'll stick it up on the screen now. But it showed what I think many people are seeing, that the cloud, public cloud spending, the hyperscalers, the spending is leveling off, if not declining. Now, of course, you have to kind of take, a lot of that stuff with a grain of salt because, this report's going to be sponsored by a mainframe software provider. And obviously, they're going to expose things that are going to be interesting to them and going to drive their agenda. But I think it truly is something that we're seeing in the space. That doesn't mean cloud spending holistically, private cloud and all the other things that go along with the cloud is declining by the same sort of a pace. But I do think that many of the enterprises are moving away from the big three hyperscalers, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. Not in a fast way, but just in diminished interest over time and pushing back on where the technology should be going and thinking a little bit more thoughtfully around where their workloads and where their data sets should be hosted. And I think that's a good thing. So let's talk about that. So despite the narratives, wholesale migration of public cloud, actual data shows that global public cloud spending still represents less than 10% of total worldwide IT expenditures, according to the report I just cited. Cloud growth is slowing, with organizations no longer following a cloud-first strategy, and instead they favor judicious, value-driven technology mixes. In other words, the ability to look at, like we talked about in the show a bunch of times, the ability to look at a mix of different technologies and using heterogeneity to your advantage. In other words, picking the best of breed platforms for whatever your particular workloads are going to be. So the percentage of compute power running on public cloud remains relatively small compared to the overall IT operations, with 85% of compute power worldwide still running on premises, including on mainframes and private cloud platforms. So what this study does is just kind of expose the fact that while cloud is still there, it's still a factor, and enterprises are still spending money on cloud, the emphasis on cloud, and certainly the cloud first mantra of a few years ago, seems to be falling by the wayside. And I think that's a good thing, because I think we need to consider all alternatives, including public cloud providers, in picking the right platforms for the apps and for the data that we're going to host, where it can be most cost effective and bring the most value back to the enterprise. And that's the purpose of us doing this. So as we talked about many times in this show before, why is this happening? Well, basically the high cost of public cloud is the significant factor. I think if cloud was a lot cheaper than it is now, we would probably be discussing a different topic because people would be moving to whatever they view as going to be cost effective. And if cloud is going to be a commodity and people are going to spend less money on it, that's obviously going to be the choice that they're going to move forward with. Organizations are discovering that many large-scale, high-transaction workloads, total cost of ownership in public cloud can exceed, 5x that of maintaining existing mainframes or, other traditional, on-prem systems. And I found that as well. Obviously, the cost of hardware is a significant factor in that. It's dropped tremendously in the last 10 years, where the cloud costs have made some incremental drops, not very much, but they still remain very high. Enterprises aren't using them effectively typically. That's a big factor here. There's a lot of self-inflicted wounds. And in many cases, as I point out in my book, people are going to spend about 2 to 3 times what they thought they were going to spend on public cloud cost. And that is something that seems to be a factor that most enterprises are considering right now. So cloud vendor contract structures often include complex pricing and penalize inefficiencies or fluctuating workloads, making it hard for many companies to achieve expected economies of scale in the cloud and raising overall IT budgets unpredictably. So it's not only just the cost of cloud, the operational costs that enterprises are spending, but the junk fees, egress, ingress fees, things like that they really didn't factor into their cost of cloud. And those things are just kind of eating many of these enterprises alive. I get complaints from CEOs all the time about their cloud bill, and they say that every month is a surprise, and it shouldn't be that way. Now, obviously, you could put that back on the enterprises, and sometimes they do. In other words, they could be spending purposefully in the cloud a bit better and put FinOps programs in place and monitor the resources that they're using a bit better. But the reality is the reality that enterprises, based on who's working there now, they're not getting the value that they think they should be getting out of public cloud providers for lots of reasons, but that's still the case. And of course, the other factor that we just mentioned earlier, declining hardware costs drive the shift to an alternative. The cost of enterprise hardware, servers, private clouds, on-prem data centers has decreased significantly, eroding one of the main economic justifications for moving to a public cloud provider at scale. So the mantra back in when cloud first started to inflect, you got to remember the model's been around for a long time, but 2008 to 2013, it started to become very interesting to enterprises out there, was that, hey, this is going to be cheaper, this is going to be better, this is going to be more agile. And while I think the agility is there, in many cases, it does provide very sophisticated services. It's not cheaper, and certainly not compared to the hardware cost. If you go off and buy hardware directly from a hardware vendor, that's going to be significantly less expensive. So the drop in hardware pricing enables organizations to build private clouds or refresh local infrastructure, cost effectively allowing for more control and predictable cost models, while often improving security and compliance in many instances. So there's reasons to leverage your own hardware stack when you look at where your applications, your data should run, data sovereignty, compliance risks, things like that. But the main thing is, if you build something on-prem, whether that's in a managed service provider and a co-location provider, in other words, you're not even seeing the hardware, it's usually done under contract, but you own the hardware, versus leveraging a public cloud service, almost always the hardware solution is going to be much cheaper, just kind of based on where the prices are right now, what public clouds are charging versus what you can buy traditional hardware stacks for. So we're also seeing emerging the alt cloud stuff. It's been around for a long time, and some of these are even considered public clouds. So we have special purpose clouds like CoreWeave and Lambda Labs out there providing GPU as a service-based systems. We have sovereign cloud providers that just work in a particular country. And also we have co-location providers and managed service providers I just mentioned that provide alternatives to leveraging hyperscalers. Now, one of the things that you're going to notice is the special purpose clouds and the sovereign clouds, those are clouds. And so how come they're not being combined with the rest of the public cloud spending? Well, in many instances, they can be, but I think that enterprises are looking at the major hyperscalers today as a distinct technology. So in other words, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, maybe Oracle, maybe IBM, things like that. And they're putting the upstart special purpose clouds and the managed service providers, things like that really kind of behave and act like clouds as something a bit different than the hyperscalers, which I think is fair. So the bottom line here is that enterprises are spending their IT dollars a bit more purposefully than they did a few years ago. So they're not following the hype as much as they did in the past because they got burned for it. And obviously we're facing AI and some of the retooling and acquisition of infrastructure, including public cloud infrastructure that needs to support those systems. So organizations don't just abandon proven technology for the latest trend today. Instead, they optimize their asset mix for specific risk profiles and geographies, business objectives, and they retain mainframes for core transaction processing and regulatory compliance. So those mainframes not going away. And they're okay with traditional systems. So if they've had systems around for many years, in some cases with the mainframes, that's going to be the case. they're not necessarily pushing back anymore on those systems. It's not a cloud first mantra and the replacement of those systems. In many cases, you can certainly do it with as much money and time as you can get. You can make anything work, but the core game we're playing here is the economic viability of those systems. So the report, I think, made it clear that achieving true value from technology investments is about carefully optimizing the asset allocation, not cloud for cloud's sake. The best performances are those who are basically pick platforms that are selective and thoughtful and leveraging multiple technology asset classes. So back to the assertion that I made, many months ago, and certainly did in my book, we're moving into these complex, heterogeneous, widely distributed environments. And I think that's where our IT future is going to be. It's not going to be on a single cloud platform. It's not going to be all on cloud platforms. It's going to be a mix of public clouds, but it's going to be a mix of various technologies, including edge computing, mainframe systems, mobile computing, whatever is going to work for the business, and it's going to bring the most value back to the business. So I think enterprises are at the point where they're not tracing the latest trends now. They're not chasing the latest shiny objects. We'll see how that goes. And certainly we have the AI stuff in front of us now. We have to deploy platforms for that. And cloud, in many cases, as I mentioned, is going to be the easy button for AI. But in attracting many enterprises to the cloud for using AI, they're also going to figure out that the costs are going to be significantly higher. And I think that is a huge factor that I don't think the public cloud providers, put into the mix. And it wasn't explained to enterprises in the way that I think it should have been explained to them by the public cloud providers, by the consulting firms, and even by the analyst firms. So don't forget to like and subscribe and check out my other videos on this channel. Also check out my InfoWorld Cloud Computing blog, 100+ LinkedIn Learning courses, and of course my generative AI architecture course out on Go Cloud Careers, and my other YouTube show, AI Insights Innovation, on the Cube Research YouTube channel, and finally my latest book, An Insider's Guide to Cloud Computing. So until next week, you guys stay very, very safe. Later.